Ethan pulled his coat tighter around him, the icy wind biting through even the thick layers. The snow-covered tundra stretched endlessly, the world around him silent except for the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. It was another cold day in the northern wilderness, where he had chosen to live far from the chaos of cities. Survival here was a challenge, but it was a challenge he had grown to love. As he walked along the ridge, his sharp eyes caught something unusual, a faint, pale figure stumbling in the distance. At first, he thought it might be an illusion caused by the snow, but then he saw her collapse. Ethan's instincts took over. He hurried toward the figure, his heart racing. When he reached her, he stopped in shock. The woman was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her skin was a smooth, pale blue, almost blending with the icy ground, and her long white hair glistened like frost. Her delicate features looked fragile, and she was trembling violently. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan knelt beside her, shaking her lightly. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that sparkled like crystal shards. She whispered something, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Your world is very cold, human," she murmured before her head slumped forward. Ethan didn't have time to question what she meant. She was freezing to death. Without hesitation, he picked her up, wrapping her in his thick coat, and carried her back toward his cabin. Inside the small wooden shelter, Ethan quickly set her down near the fireplace. He threw a few logs into the flames, stoking them until the warmth began to fill the room. The woman's shivering slowed, but her lips were still a faint blue. Ethan grabbed a blanket and carefully wrapped it around her. "Come on, stay with me," he muttered, his voice firm yet gentle. Her eyes opened again, and this time she seemed more aware. She looked around the cabin, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Where am I?" she asked, her words slow and soft. "You're safe. This is my home," Ethan replied, kneeling beside her. "You were out in the cold. You're lucky I found you. What were you doing out there?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the flickering flames. I don't know," she said finally. "I crashed, somewhere nearby. Everything is so cold here. I didn't know it would be like this." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Crashed? What do you mean? Are you from one of the research stations?" She shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not. From here," she said, her voice carrying a hint of sorrow. Ethan didn't press further. Whoever she was, she needed help. "You'll warm up soon. Just rest," he said, moving to his small kitchen area. He poured hot water into a cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. It'll help." She took the cup, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ethan felt an inexplicable sense of connection, as though there was something deeper she wasn't telling him. "Thank you," she whispered, taking a small sip. The hours passed, and the woman's color slowly returned. She sat closer to the fire, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Ethan couldn't help but watch her, questions swirling in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why did she call his world cold as though it wasn't her own? For now, Ethan decided, those questions could wait. Survival came first, and he would do whatever it took to ensure she stayed alive. Ethan woke to the crackle of the fire still burning in the hearth. The cabin was warm, but his mind was clouded with questions. He glanced toward the woman wrapped in blankets near the fireplace. Her pale blue skin seemed healthier now, her shivering had stopped, and her breathing was steady. She stirred, opening her crystal-like eyes, and looked around the room. Her gaze settled on Ethan, who was sitting at the edge of his cot. "You're awake," he said softly. She nodded, her movements slow. "Yes, but I still feel strange." Her voice was soft, carrying a hint of exhaustion. Ethan brought her another cup of hot water. "Here, this will help." She accepted it, her delicate hands trembling slightly as she sipped the warm liquid. "Thank you," she whispered. He sat across from her, watching her closely. "You're lucky I found you out there." The cold isn't forgiving. What were you doing in the middle of nowhere? She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the fire. Finally, she spoke. I wasn't prepared for this. Ethan frowned. Prepared for what? Are you part of a research team? Or, he paused, thinking about her unusual appearance. You're not from here, are you? Her shoulders sank, and she shook her head. No, I'm not. She placed the cup down, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. My name is Lyra. I came here. By accident. An accident? Ethan's curiosity grew. You mentioned something about crashing. Was it a plane? A ship? A ship, she said softly, her voice barely audible. But not like the ones you have here. It's different. Ethan's mind raced. A ship that wasn't like theirs. Her strange appearance, her unfamiliarity with Earth's cold, it all pointed to one conclusion, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he asked, where is it now? I don't know, Lyra admitted. It went down far from here. I managed to get out, but I didn't realize how harsh this place would be. The cold is. She trailed off, glancing at the fire. I've never felt anything like it. Ethan leaned back, absorbing her words. You're lucky to be alive. Out here, the cold can kill in minutes if you're not prepared. Lyra looked at him, her expression filled with both gratitude and curiosity. Your people, how do you survive in such a place? Ethan chuckled. We adapt. We learn how to stay warm, build shelters, and make fires. Humans are pretty good at surviving, even in the harshest conditions. She tilted her head slightly. Fire. I've never seen it up close before. It's so alive. Ethan smiled. It's not alive, but it can feel that way. It's one of the most important things for survival here. Without it, we wouldn't last long. Lyra extended a hand toward the flames, hesitating as the warmth brushed her fingers. It's beautiful, she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan watched her with a mixture of awe and concern. She seemed so fragile, yet there was something resilient about her. You'll need to stay warm and rest for now, he said. When the storm clears, we can figure out where your ship is and what to do next. Her gaze shifted to him, and she nodded. Thank you, Ethan. You saved my life. He waved it off, just doing what anyone would. Lyra's expression softened. No, she said firmly. Not everyone would. Where I'm from, kindness isn't common. Her words hung in the air, and Ethan didn't press further. Instead, he stoked the fire, adding another log. Well, around here, it's survival first. If we don't help each other, we don't make it. Lyra leaned closer to the warmth, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She was beginning to understand that Ethan's world, cold and unforgiving as it was, also held something precious, an unyielding spirit that refused to let even the harshest elements win. Ethan watched her silently, wondering what other truths she hadn't shared. Whatever the answers were, he knew one thing for sure. Lyra wasn't just a visitor from another place. She was a mystery, and her presence was about to change his life forever. Ethan glanced out the small cabin window, his breath fogging the glass. The storm outside raged fiercely, the wind howling like a wild beast. Snow swirled violently, blanketing the landscape in a thick, impenetrable white. There was no chance of venturing outside, not until the storm passed. Behind him, Lyra sat near the fire, her pale blue skin now glowing with a soft warmth from the heat. She had recovered some strength, but her curiosity was as alive as ever. She held her hands close to the flames, watching them dance with wide, fascinated eyes. Is it always like this? She asked, her voice calm, but tinged with awe. Ethan turned to her, shaking his head. Not always, but storms like this are common in winter. You get used to them after a while. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Used to them? How do you adapt to something so hostile? The cold alone feels like it's trying to end me. Ethan chuckled and pulled a chair closer to her. You'd be surprised what humans can handle. We've lived in places like this for centuries, maybe longer. We find ways to survive. Better clothing, warm shelters, and knowing when to stay put. Lyra nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting back to the fire. On my world, the environment is controlled. There are no storms, no wild elements like this. Everything is balanced and predictable. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sounds peaceful. It is, Lyra admitted, though her tone was hesitant. But it's also limiting. We've forgotten how to survive on our own. If something like this happened to us, most wouldn't make it. Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. So you're not just visiting Earth, are you? Your people must have sent you here for a reason. Lyra hesitated, her fingers curling slightly as if to protect a secret. I wasn't supposed to come here, she said finally. My ship malfunctioned. It wasn't meant for this kind of environment. And now, I'm stranded. Ethan nodded, sensing the weight of her words. Well, you're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out. But first, you need to get through this storm. As if on cue, a loud gust of wind shook the cabin, the sound making Lyra flinch. Ethan stood up, checking the windows to ensure no snow had blown inside. Storms like this can last a day or two, he said, his voice steady. Good thing I stocked up on firewood. Lyra watched him as he moved around the cabin, her curiosity growing. You make it sound simple, but it's not, is it? You've prepared for this. You've learned. Had to, Ethan replied, shrugging. Out here, you don't get second chances. You mess up, you freeze. So you learn fast, or you don't make it. Lyra seemed to ponder his words, then asked, do you ever wish for something easier? A life where survival isn't so demanding. Ethan paused, then smiled. Sometimes, but there's something satisfying about knowing I can handle it. That I don't need much to keep going. It's tough, sure, but it makes you appreciate the little things, like this fire. She gave him a small smile, her crystalline eyes reflecting the flames. I think I understand. On my world, we have everything we need, but it feels empty, like something's missing. Ethan sat back down, his gaze meeting hers. Maybe it's the challenge. Struggling to survive teaches you what's important. It's not just about staying alive. It's about finding meaning in the fight. Lyra nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps, though I never imagined I'd find meaning in a place so cold. Ethan grinned. Stick around. You might find more than you expect. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth and understanding began to grow between the two. Despite their differences, they were learning from each other, and for the first time, Lyra felt a sense of hope in the harsh, frozen wilderness. The storm showed no signs of easing, trapping Ethan and Lyra inside the small cabin for another day. While Ethan was used to these forced periods of rest, Lyra seemed restless. She kept pacing near the fire, her delicate frame casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Is it always this quiet? She asked, glancing toward the window, where only white nothingness could be seen. Ethan looked up from where he was sharpening a hunting knife. When the storm comes, yeah. No animals, no people, just the wind. Why? Does it bother you? Lyra hesitated. It's unsettling. I'm not used to this kind of stillness. Back home, there's always movement, sounds, life. Ethan chuckled. You'll get used to it. Quiet can be good. It clears your head. She sighed, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I feel useless. I'm not like you. You know how to survive here. I don't. Ethan set the knife down and leaned forward. Then let's change that. Lyra blinked, confused. Change what? You, Ethan said with a grin. You want to stop feeling useless. I'll teach you what you need to know. Start with the basics. She frowned but nodded, intrigued. All right, where do we start? Ethan brought out an extra coat and a pair of thick gloves. First, you need to dress for the cold. What you've got on now won't cut it. Lyra examined the coat with a skeptical look. "This looks heavy." "It is," Ethan replied, helping her put it on. "But it'll keep you warm. Layers are your best friend out here." Once she was bundled up, Ethan opened the cabin door briefly, letting in a gust of icy air. Lyra flinched, instinctively stepping back. "You have to face it," he said, stepping outside. "Come on." Reluctantly, Lyra followed him. The cold bit at her exposed face, but the layers of clothing protected her from the worst of it. She hugged herself tightly, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Now, pay attention," Ethan said, kneeling in the snow. "If you're ever caught out here without shelter, you need to know how to make one. Watch." He began digging into a drift of snow, carving out a small hollow. Lyra watched in fascination as he explained the principles of trapping body heat and protecting against the wind. "This is called a snow cave," Ethan said. "It's not perfect, but it can save your life." Lyra crouched beside him, her blue hands carefully mimicking his movements. She was clumsy at first, but Ethan guided her patiently, correcting her technique. "I didn't expect snow to be useful," she admitted, her voice muffled by the scarf around her face. "Everything can be useful if you know how to use it," Ethan said, smiling. Back inside, Ethan showed her how to light a fire using matches and kindling. It took her several tries, but when the flames finally caught, she gasped in delight. "I did it," she exclaimed, her crystal-like eyes lighting up. "See, you're learning," Ethan said, clapping her on the shoulder. Lyra looked at the fire, then back at Ethan. "This is harder than I thought, but it feels good. Like I'm accomplishing something real." Ethan nodded. "That's the thing about surviving out here. Every little victory feels big because it matters. You're not just getting by, you're fighting back." Lyra's smile faded slightly. "On my world, we don't fight back. We're taught to avoid struggles, to rely on systems that do the work for us. But now, I see what we've lost. I never thought I'd say this, but maybe your world has something ours doesn't." Ethan met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it does, or maybe it's just showing you what you're capable of." Lyra stared into the fire, her mind swirling with new thoughts. For the first time since she had arrived, she didn't feel so helpless. Ethan's world was cold and harsh, but it was also teaching her something valuable: how to survive, and maybe even thrive. The storm finally passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a pristine white desert. Ethan stood at the cabin door, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. The sun peeked over the horizon, its light bouncing off the snow and creating a blinding glare. Behind him, Lyra approached cautiously, still adjusting to the heavy coat and layers he had given her. She looked out at the vast expanse, her expression a mix of awe and trepidation. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but still so cold." Ethan chuckled. "You'll get used to it. Let's see how you handle the real thing." She gave him a wary look. "The real thing." "We're going out," he said, handing her a pair of snowshoes. "You can't stay cooped up in the cabin forever. Time to put what you've learned to use." Lyra hesitated but nodded. "All right. What do I do with these?" Ethan showed her how to strap on the snowshoes and adjust them. At first, she stumbled awkwardly, the wide frames making her steps clumsy. Ethan stayed close, offering support and guidance. "Take it slow," he said. "Walk like this, lift your feet higher, and keep them steady." After a few minutes, she found her rhythm, moving with more confidence. The effort warmed her body, and for the first time, the cold didn't feel so unbearable. "See, you're getting it," Ethan said with a grin. Lyra smiled back, a small spark of pride in her eyes. "It's harder than it looks, but it's not impossible." As they ventured farther from the cabin, Ethan taught Lyra how to read the landscape. He pointed out animal tracks in the snow, explaining which creatures made them and how they survived the harsh conditions. "These are rabbit tracks," he said, kneeling to show her. "They're quick and small, which helps them avoid predators." Lyra crouched beside him, studying the tracks intently. It's amazing how everything adapts here. Even the smallest creatures find a way. Ethan nodded. That's nature for you. Survival doesn't play favorites. It's about who can adapt the best. As they continued, Lyra began to see the beauty in the stark, frozen world. The snow-covered trees sparkled in the sunlight, and the crisp air felt invigorating. She even started to enjoy the challenge of navigating the uneven terrain. The peaceful moment didn't last. A distant howl echoed through the air, making Lyra freeze in her tracks. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Ethan's expression grew serious. "Wolves. They're not usually a problem, but we should keep moving." Lyra glanced around nervously, her hands tightening into fists. "Are they dangerous?" "They can be," Ethan admitted, "but they won't attack unless they're desperate. Just stay close to me." The howls grew louder as they pressed on. Lyra's heart raced, her mind imagining all sorts of dangers. When they reached a clearing, Ethan stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. Lyra followed his gaze and saw a pair of wolves emerging from the tree line. Their eyes gleamed, and their breath formed white puffs in the cold air. Ethan calmly reached for a flare gun strapped to his belt. "Easy now," he muttered, his voice steady. The wolves snarled but didn't approach. Ethan fired the flare into the air, the bright red light startling the animals. With a yelp, they retreated into the forest. Lyra exhaled shakily, her knees trembling. That was terrifying. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did fine. Fear is normal, but staying calm is what keeps you alive." Lyra nodded, her admiration for Ethan growing. "You make it look so easy." "It's not," he said with a small smile. "But you're stronger than you think, Lyra. You handled that well." As they made their way back to the cabin, Lyra felt a newfound sense of respect for Ethan's world. It was dangerous and unforgiving, but it also had a raw, untamed beauty that she was beginning to appreciate. For the first time, she didn't feel like a helpless outsider. She felt like someone learning to adapt, to survive, and maybe even belong. The cabin was warm and quiet, the only sound the steady crackle of the fire. Lyra sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of steaming tea Ethan had made. The events of the day played over in her mind, the wolves, the vast, snowy expanse, and how much she had relied on Ethan. She felt stronger than before, but also deeply aware of how different their worlds were. Ethan, sitting at the small wooden table, glanced at her. "You've been quiet since we got back. Everything all right?" Lyra nodded slowly but didn't look up. "I've just been thinking." "About?" Ethan prompted, setting down the tool he had been repairing. Lyra hesitated, staring into the fire. "About my ship," she said finally. "And why I'm here." Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "You've been holding back," he said gently. "I've been patient, but I think it's time you told me the full story." Lyra met his gaze, her crystal-like eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "You're right. You deserve to know." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I come from a place far beyond this world," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "My people, we don't live like you do. Everything on our planet is controlled and precise. The environment, the weather, even the way we interact with each other, it's all managed. There's no danger, no unpredictability. And because of that, there's no growth." Ethan listened intently, not interrupting. "Our leaders sent a small team to explore worlds like yours," Lyra continued. "They wanted to observe, to see how other species survive without the systems we depend on. My ship was part of that mission, but something went wrong during the landing. The atmosphere, it interfered with our navigation systems." She paused, her hands tightening around the cup. "We crashed far from our intended location. I don't know what happened to the others. I was thrown clear of the wreckage, and when I woke up, I was alone. The cold, it was unbearable. I started walking, hoping to find shelter, and then you found me. Ethan sat back, processing her words. So, you were sent here to study us. Like an experiment. Lyra winced at the term, but nodded. In a way, yes. But I never expected to be part of it like this. I've seen more in these few days with you than I ever thought possible. Ethan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snowy landscape. Your people sound different, controlled, like you said. But why risk sending you here if they didn't prepare you for the cold? Lyra sighed. They didn't think it was necessary. They underestimated the challenges of your world, just like I did. We thought we could observe from a distance, but Earth has a way of forcing you to face it directly. Ethan turned back to her, his expression thoughtful. And now, what do you plan to do? Lyra hesitated, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. I don't know. My beacon is damaged. Without it, I can't signal my people. Even if I could, I'm not sure I want to go back. Ethan's brow furrowed. Why not? Because, she said, her voice firm, I've seen something here that I've never seen back home. Resilience. You don't just survive, Ethan. You thrive in the face of adversity. You adapt. You fight back. It's something my people have forgotten, and I'm not sure I can return to a life without it. Ethan walked back to the table and sat across from her. You're stronger than you think, Lyra. You've already started adapting. But if we're going to fix that beacon and figure out your next step, we need to work together. Lyra looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. You'd help me, even after everything I've told you. Ethan grinned. Of course. Survival's a team effort out here. Besides, I'm curious to see what other surprises you've got. Lyra laughed softly, the tension easing from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was learning to live, thanks to the unexpected kindness of a human in the coldest place she had ever known. The morning dawned clear, but bitterly cold. Ethan packed supplies into a sturdy backpack, his movements quick and efficient. Lyra watched him from the edge of the cabin, her pale blue hands tucked into the oversized gloves he had given her. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her breath forming soft clouds in the freezing air. Ethan glanced at her with a reassuring smile. It's the only idea. If your beacon's still intact, it's our best chance to figure out what happens next. Besides, staying here won't fix anything. Lyra nodded, her resolve firming despite her lingering doubts. She had come a long way since Ethan had first found her. The cold still bit at her skin, but she was learning to endure it. More importantly, she was learning to trust herself and Ethan. All right, she said, pulling the fur-lined hood of her coat over her head. Let's find that beacon. The trek through the frozen wilderness was slow and grueling. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, the only sounds the crunch of their snowshoes and the occasional whistle of the wind. Ethan led the way, his practiced movements cutting a path through the deep drifts. Lyra followed closely, her body straining against the unfamiliar terrain. Her breathing was steady but labored, each step a reminder of how different this world was from her own. Still, she refused to complain. Ethan had taught her too much for her to give up now. Keep your pace steady, Ethan called over his shoulder. Don't rush, or you'll burn out too fast. I'm fine, Lyra replied, her voice determined. He glanced back and gave her an approving nod. You're doing great. We're making good time. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, its pale light casting long shadows across the snow. They stopped briefly to rest and drink from a thermos of hot tea Ethan had packed. Lyra held the cup between her gloved hands, savoring the warmth. Your world feels endless, she said, her gaze sweeping over the horizon. Ethan chuckled. It can feel that way sometimes, but every place has its limits. You just have to know where to look. Lyra smiled faintly. Your optimism is strange to me. My people see obstacles as reasons to stop, not as challenges to overcome. Maybe that's why you ended up here, Ethan said thoughtfully. To see things differently. She tilted her head, considering his words. Maybe you're right. By mid-afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Ethan pulled out a small pair of binoculars and scanned the area. There, he said, pointing. Lyra followed his gaze and saw a faint glimmer of metallic wreckage half buried in the snow. Her heart raced. That's it. That's my ship. Ethan smiled but remained cautious. Let's get closer and see what we're dealing with. The descent into the valley was steep and treacherous. Ethan moved carefully, testing each step before putting his weight down. Lyra mimicked his movements, her confidence growing with every successful step. When they finally reached the wreckage, Lyra's excitement turned to worry. The ship's once sleek surface was scarred and twisted, its edges coated in ice. She knelt beside it, her gloved hands brushing away the snow to reveal the beacon. "It's damaged," she said, her voice trembling. "But it might still work." Ethan crouched beside her, inspecting the beacon with a practiced eye. "It's not beyond repair. We'll need some tools, but I think we can fix it." Lyra looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "You really think so?" Ethan nodded. "Absolutely. But we'll have to work fast. The temperature's dropping, and we don't want to be stuck out here after dark." Together, they began the painstaking process of repairing the beacon. Ethan's hands moved with practiced skill, while Lyra followed his instructions, her determination overriding her inexperience. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the beacon began to hum faintly. Lyra's face lit up with relief. "It's working." Ethan grinned, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Told you we'd fix it." Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her gratitude shining through her tired eyes. "Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't have done this without you." He shrugged, his smile turning soft. "That's what survival's about, helping each other." For the first time, Lyra felt a sense of accomplishment. The cold world around her didn't feel as hostile anymore. Instead, it felt like a place where she was learning to thrive, thanks to the unlikely bond she had formed with the human who had saved her. As the beacon emitted its faint hum, Lyra's relief was short-lived. Ethan, kneeling next to the damaged device, frowned as he examined the connections. "It's working, but not perfectly," he said, tightening a loose wire. "The signal is weak. It might take time for your people to pick it up, if they're even looking for you." Lyra swallowed, her earlier hope dimming. "They'll come," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure. Her people weren't known for prioritizing individuals over efficiency. Ethan stood, dusting snow from his gloves. "Let's not take any chances. We'll wait near the ship for as long as it's safe, but we need a backup plan in case they don't show." Lyra nodded, though the thought of being stranded filled her with dread. "What kind of backup plan?" "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, giving her a reassuring smile. "For now, let's focus on staying warm and keeping the beacon running." The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan built a small fire near the shipwreck, its flickering flames casting long shadows across the snow. Lyra sat close to the warmth, her pale blue hands outstretched. "I don't know how you do this," she admitted, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Your world is relentless." Ethan sat beside her, his eyes on the distant stars. "You get used to it. The trick is not fighting it. You learn to work with what the world gives you." Lyra glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You make it sound easy, but I know it's not." Ethan chuckled. "It's not. But you've come a long way. You're tougher than you think, Lyra." Her smile faded as she looked at the beacon, its faint glow barely visible in the darkness. "I just hope it's enough." The night brought more challenges. The wind picked up, blowing icy gusts that threatened to extinguish the fire. Ethan and Lyra worked together to shield the flames, piling snow around the base to create a barrier. As they huddled close, Lyra spoke quietly. "If my people don't come, what will happen to me?" Ethan hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find a way. You're not alone in this." Lyra looked at him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "You've done so much for me already. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to, Ethan said firmly. Out here, we help each other. That's how we survive. As the night wore on, the wind grew harsher, and the cold became nearly unbearable. Lyra, despite her newfound resilience, began to falter. Her body wasn't built for this level of exposure, and Ethan could see her struggling. We can't stay out here much longer, he said, his tone urgent. Lyra nodded weakly. But the beacon. I'll keep it running, Ethan said, standing. You need to stay warm. I'll figure something out. Before Lyra could protest, Ethan removed his own outer coat and wrapped it around her. The sudden loss of warmth made him shiver, but he didn't hesitate. Ethan, no. Lyra protested, trying to give it back. You need it more than I do, he said firmly. I'll be fine. Just stay by the fire. Lyra's eyes filled with worry, but she could see the determination in Ethan's face. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, her heart heavy with guilt and gratitude. Hours later, as the storm began to subside, the beacon emitted a stronger pulse. Lyra, watching it intently, gasped. It's working. The signal's stronger. Ethan, sitting a short distance away, smiled weakly. Told you we'd make it work. Lyra rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she touched his cold face. You're freezing, Ethan. You gave me your coat. Why would you do that? Because I couldn't let you freeze, he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she helped him back to the fire. You risked your life for me. Ethan met her gaze, his voice soft but unwavering. That's what we do. We fight for each other. In that moment, Lyra realized she had learned more than just survival skills from Ethan. She had learned what it meant to care, to sacrifice, and to truly connect with another being. As the first faint lights of dawn appeared on the horizon, Lyra vowed to never forget the lessons of this cold, unforgiving world, or the human who had shown her its warmth. The first light of dawn spilled across the snowy valley, painting the landscape in hues of soft pink and gold. The beacon's pulse grew steady and strong, its rhythmic hum a signal of hope. Lyra and Ethan sat by the fire, both weary but alive, their bond forged through the trials of survival. It's working, Lyra said softly, her eyes fixed on the beacon. They'll find me now. Ethan gave her a small smile, his face still pale from the cold. Good. That's what we've been working for. Lyra glanced at him, her crystalline eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. I owe you everything, Ethan. Without you, I wouldn't have survived a single day here. He shrugged, his grin faint but warm. You would have figured it out eventually. You're tougher than you think. Lyra. She shook her head, her voice steady but emotional. No, I survived because you taught me how. You showed me what it means to adapt, to endure, and to care for someone else. My world doesn't teach those things. Ethan looked away, his gaze resting on the horizon. Your world might not teach it, but you've learned it now. That's what matters. The distant hum of an approaching craft broke the silence. Lyra stood, her breath catching as a sleek, silver ship appeared in the sky, its lights piercing through the early morning haze. They're here, she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. Ethan rose slowly, his body stiff from the cold. He watched the ship descend, its engines humming softly as it landed a short distance away. A group of figures emerged, their movements precise and calculated. Lyra turned to Ethan, her expression conflicted. I don't know if I'm ready to leave. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You are. This is your chance to go home, to share what you've learned. They need you, Lyra. Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded. And what about you? What will you do? Ethan smiled faintly. I'll keep doing what I always do, surviving. Don't worry about me. You've got your own journey now. As Lyra approached the ship, one of her people stepped forward. Their pale blue skin and elegant features mirrored her own, but their demeanor was cold and formal. Lyra, the figure said, their tone clipped. We've been searching for you. "Are you injured?" Lyra shook her head. "No, I'm fine, thanks to him." She gestured toward Ethan, who stood at a distance, watching silently. The figure's eyes flicked toward Ethan, their expression unreadable. "A human?" "Yes," Lyra said firmly. "He saved my life. More than that, he taught me things our world has forgotten: resilience, kindness, and the strength to face challenges. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here." The figure hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Lyra didn't wait for their approval. She turned back to Ethan, her voice trembling as she called out, "Ethan, thank you. For everything." He raised a hand in a small wave, his smile genuine despite the sadness in his eyes. "Take care of yourself, Lyra. Show them what you're made of." The ship's engines roared to life, lifting off the snowy ground. Lyra stood at a window, her eyes locked on Ethan as he grew smaller and smaller in the distance. She placed a hand on the glass, a silent promise forming in her heart. Back on the ground, Ethan watched the ship disappear into the sky. The silence of the tundra returned, but it felt different now, less lonely, more alive. He turned toward his cabin, a sense of pride and hope swelling in his chest. Lyra had come to his world unprepared and unsure, but she had left it stronger and wiser. And though they were from different worlds, they had shared something rare and powerful, a connection that neither distance nor time could erase. Ethan smiled to himself as he walked back through the snow, ready to face whatever the cold world threw at him next.